Hello and welcome to the Community Builders webinar series. My name is Allison Berry and I will be your moderator today. We also have Jillian Sutherland on the line and she will jump in if we have any technical issues. Today's webinar is Cities Building Community Wealth. The session is underwritten by the Small Urban and Rural Livability Center at Montana State University's Western Transportation Institute. We thank them for their support. We have with us today Sarah McKinley, Manager of Community Development Programs with the Democracy Collaborative. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Sarah will be presenting an emerging new way of doing community economic development called community wealth building. This is a systems approach to creating an inclusive, sustainable economy where we can all thrive. But first, a bit of background about Community Builders. We are a nonprofit organization aimed at helping local leaders to create more livable communities in the American West. For more information about Community Builders, as well as our blog, research, publications, and more, check out our website, which is communitybuilders.org. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted later this afternoon. And we will also post today's PowerPoint slides if you'd like to access those. So if anyone has any questions during today's webinar, you can type them into the questions panel on your screen and we'll answer as many as time allows for after the presentation. So let's get started. We're going to turn the controls over to Sarah and you can take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison, and everyone at Community Builders. I'm really thrilled to be here. I hope everyone can hear me and see the screen clearly. And thank you to everybody on the line listening in. I'm really thrilled that so many people are excited and interested in this work. So before I get into it, just a little bit about myself. As Allison said, I am the manager of community development programs for the Democracy Collaborative. I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area, but I work nationally. I have a degree in urban planning, so I am an urban planner at heart, and my background is in community development. I worked for community development corporations and support associations for most of my career and have been with the Democracy Collaborative since about 2012. With the Democracy Collaborative, as in my role as community development programs manager, I have worked on a project called the Learning Action Lab for Community Wealth Building, working with 5 Native American community organizations across the west and northwest of the United States. I'll talk a little bit about that project a little bit later. But I also have worked on research and advisory work as well, and work called and in our collaborative. You look there. Activities in their communities. So before I get into
Sarah,
a little bit more.
Sarah, are you still there? Can you hear me? Your audio is jumping in and out. So I'm going to take a minute and just see if we can fix that. You sounded fine earlier. I wonder if...
Can you hear me better now?
No, you're still jumping in and out. Can you... let's see. Would you be able to call in on your phone? I still can't hear you. I'm sorry. Geez, this is a new issue for me. So I apologize. Here, why don't we... I'm going to put the webinar on hold for a minute and we will be back in 1 second. Hold on a minute. Sarah, are you there now?
Hello. I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that sounds much better. I apologize. I don't know what was wrong, but let's see.
Well, it could be on my end. I apologize to everyone on the line.
Okay, so if you don't mind starting from the top.
Yeah, I hope it doesn't happen again because I don't know what caused it.
Okay, well, let's just go ahead and restart, and I think we'll get a fresh start, and it sounds good now, so that's much better.
All right. Well, I apologize to everyone on the line, and I just hope you can still hear me.
I know. These things happen, so not a big deal. We didn't lose a whole lot of time, so why don't you just go right? Yeah.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much. I just wanted to give a little bit about myself. I am an urban planner by training, but my background is in community development. I've worked for community development corporations and associations for most of my career, and I joined the Democracy Collaborative in 2012. In my role with the Democracy Collaborative, I do research and support work, and I also coordinate programs. One of my main programs is something called the Learning Action Lab for Community Development, working with five Native American community development organizations in the west and northwest of the United States, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. I wanted to focus in this presentation on our latest report, of which I'm a co-author, called Cities Building Community Wealth, focusing on how city governments can support the work of community wealth building going on in their neighborhoods and communities and cities. So I will talk a little bit more about community wealth building throughout this whole presentation. But before I do that, let me tell you a little bit more about the Democracy Collaborative. We are a research, field building, and advisory organization committed to advancing a vision for a new and just economic system. So we were founded in 2000 at the University of Maryland, and we were oriented towards promoting democratic renewal and community revitalization by addressing the root causes of economic inequality. So we're really interested in promoting a new economic system that really gets at economic inequalities and works to create a more inclusive economy for all. So we do that through research. We have reports and resources available that we promote across the country, field building. We have communities of practice, cohort learning, and so forth, and advisory work. We do direct advisory work in communities. I believe a few folks that we've worked with are on the line. We have worked in Denver and Cleveland. We're currently working in Rochester, New York, and Richmond, Virginia, but a number of other places as well. We have two offices, one here in Washington, D.C., where I am based. It's our largest office. And then another in Cleveland, Ohio. Actually, that's where our executive director is located. He moved there when we began working with the Cleveland Foundation and a network of anchor institutions based there to develop the Evergreen Cooperatives, which some on the line may know about. So I'll talk more about that later in the presentation. So I'm trying to go to the next slide. Not going.
Sometimes you just have to re-click onto your PowerPoint. If you've been using the go-to.
There we go.
Yeah, there you go.
There we are. Okay. So, community wealth building. I've mentioned that term a number of times already on the line. So what does that mean? This is a pretty long definition here. You can read that as you like, but really the key things about community wealth building are that it is a system approach. Did I lose my screen?
So I can see your screen now, but I see your PowerPoint in outline view. Yeah, now we're at community wealth and economic trends.
Everybody is getting a quick glimpse of everything here. All right. I believe we're back on target here.
Okay, yep, I'm at community wealth building.
All right. So here we are. Here we are. This is the definition. You can read it. Again, this is in the report here. But the most important things to note about community wealth building is that it is a systems approach to inclusive, collaborative economic development that is rooted in place through broadly held ownership. So the keys here are ownership and inclusiveness to get at a better system of economic development. So that's what we're looking at here. And I do want to emphasize that community wealth building is not a new thing. This is something that community organizations, community groups, community actors, stakeholders, cities have been doing in various forms all over the country for decades. What we've done is really looked at the key elements that make this approach different from a traditional economic development approach and put it together in a cohesive framework to help connect the dots and bring the elements together in a compelling way. So we call this community wealth building, but as I go through this presentation, I'm sure that you'll recognize a lot of these elements in your own community, a lot of this work that's been going on for a long time. And what I believe is so exciting about this frame is that it really lifts up these disparate, disconnected activities and connects them together in a way that really makes it a powerful alternative for communities. So why are we interested in an alternative to the way economic development is done traditionally? Well, we all know wealth inequality is at an all-time high. The Wall Street Journal reported that since 2009, 95% of all income gains have gone to the wealthiest 1% of people in our country. So more wealth is concentrated in the hands of fewer people. 400 individuals have almost twice as much wealth as the lower 185 million people in the United States. These are staggering statistics, and of course these are caused by many reasons, many trends, global and local and other things, and many beyond our control. But of course we see things in our communities like stagnating wages, the growth of low wage and part-time work, decrease in manufacturing and other stable jobs. So you're seeing these in your community, you're feeling the impacts of it. And we believe that the way we've gone about economic development traditionally in our country has had a role to play in these trends. $800 billion a year is given away in tax subsidies to corporations that are not rooted in community, not owned locally, and instead are owned by investors and stockholders and are privy to the whims of Wall Street. So one way we try to address this is by looking at different ways to root wealth locally and broaden that. And community wealth building has a number of different ways to do that. And here we have the drivers of community wealth building juxtaposed with a traditional approach to economic development. We believe this begins with place, focusing on place and the assets that exist already in place and utilizing and lifting up those assets benefits local residents. The traditional approach often focuses on luring industry and business from other places and doing so through incentives and subsidies, which often burdens local residents through a decrease in taxes. One way to root, and this is what we think is most important, to root enterprise and wealth in place is by promoting different forms of broad-based and inclusive ownership, and I'll get into that a little bit more. Again, a traditional approach often focuses on firms, large firms that are owned by absentee and elite ownership, stockholders, investors, and things of that nature. We believe that rooting things in place encourages multipliers, recirculation of money locally, and if you can connect with local demand and have that local demand serviced by local supply, then you're recirculating that money within the community. And you can do that in a collaborative way by bringing multiple players to the table, businesses, institutions, nonprofit, government, philanthropy, things of that nature, rather than a traditional approach, which is often just two players at the table, government, business, developers, things of that nature. And inherently, this should be an inclusive approach. You're intentionally including those who have been excluded. These are people who are left out traditionally from our economy and economic opportunity in our communities. How can we include them in this process in a more prosperous and productive way? And by doing so, how do we connect job opportunities to real jobs? How do we create real pipelines for people who have been excluded and face high barriers to employment in their communities? And then connecting all of this together, we're looking at this as an ecosystem, and how can all of these different dots work together to be more supportive to our communities and the people who live in them, rather than just leaning on sort of top-down, trickle-down approaches. So that's the way community wealth building works and connects all of these different parts together. So starting with place, we know that place matters. This map here is of Cleveland, Ohio. On the left, or well, on my left, you see a neighborhood of Huff, which is a largely African-American low-income community in the inner city of Cleveland. The life expectancy there is 64 years. Just 8 miles away in a suburb of Lyndhurst, largely white, a middle-class, stable community, the average life expectancy is 88 years. That's a 22-year difference in life expectancy in 8 miles. You know, that's a huge gap. Where we've been doing some work on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, the average life expectancy for a Native American male is 46 years of age. That's one of the lowest life expectancy rates in the Western Hemisphere, second only to Haiti, and that's within the borders of the United States. So we know that place matters. Where you live determines your access, your opportunity, your health, and the conditions of your life. We know that 40% of health, meaning your physical well-being, is actually determined by social and economic factors. Your employment status, your education status, your community conditions, and so forth directly impact your health. So we really, in order to address these disparities that really manifest themselves in place, we have to come up with solutions that are rooted in place, that really work for the communities that they're in. So how do we do that? One way we think at the Democracy Collaborative that we can do that is focus on ownership that includes people and communities and roots wealth in place. So this is what we call our spectrum of inclusive ownership, looking at a number of examples of how you can have more inclusive, more rooted, more broadly held ownership. It's hard to do this linearly because these are all different degrees. And of course, not everything is a guarantee of inclusiveness, but these different structures of ownership do help to broaden and open up wealth and ownership of assets in communities. So we'll get into that in the next slide. So here are a number of the different types of broad-based ownership that we talk about when we talk about this. We have a new report available called Broad-Based Ownership Models as Tools for Job Creation and Community Development. It is also available for free on our website. You can go and download it. And it gets into a lot more of the details of each of these different forms. I'm sure you're familiar with many of these different forms. I'm sure they exist in most of your communities. ESOPs, for example, employee stock ownership plans, are very popular and a very large sector of our economy. Cooperatives, there are many different kinds of cooperatives. There are consumer cooperatives, producer cooperatives, financial cooperatives, employee-owned cooperatives, community development, financial institutions are financial institutions, lending and banking institutions that are actually owned and operated by a community board with the goal of recirculating and lending money within the community. Social enterprises is a term that's become very popular. It is used to refer to all different kinds of social enterprise. At the Democracy Collaborative, we usually mean a social enterprise as an enterprise that is owned by a nonprofit, owned and operated by a nonprofit, with the profits going into supporting the work of a community-based nonprofit. Municipal enterprise, there are many more of these than people are aware of, but of course if a city owns an enterprise, they have more control over the way that the utility or the waste or other things are managed. There are many exciting different ways to see municipal enterprises used for better rates and also better sustainable and ecological outcomes for communities. And more you're starting to see hybrids of these things, things like benefit corporations and limited liability corporations that enable enterprises to do more than just produce profit. So you'll be seeing a lot more of those coming along. An example of some of these that we've just talked to, ESOP, for example, New Belgium Brewery, which is in Fort Collins, Colorado, as I'm sure you know, is the nation's third largest craft brewer and employs over 450 people, and have an extremely low turnover. Right now they're estimating, and these numbers are from 2012, they're estimating that they only have a 3% turnover. Namaste Solar, also in Colorado, in Boulder, is an employee-owned cooperative. It has the largest market share in Colorado of photovoltaic system installation, and $15 million of revenue there. Very successful business, and all of their employees are employee owners. They call them team members. I'm sorry, half of their employees are team members or employee owners. That means they have one member, one vote, so they have a vote in the operating of the cooperative, and they also share in the profits of it. Social enterprise, Pioneer Human Services in Washington State, in Seattle, is one of the largest social enterprises in the country. It started in 1962 at the time as a nonprofit, and it was fully grant funded. Now, over about 50 years later, they have over 700 employees, most of them ex-offenders and drug users or recovering addicts, and they have a number of businesses, including a metal fabricating business, which does supply to Boeing right there in Seattle. They now make $55 million in revenue a year. That goes back into supporting the services that they have for returning citizens and recovering addicts, and they require almost no grant funding to offer those services as a result of their successful, profitable businesses. So those are some good examples of these things, you know. And these different forms of ownership have many benefits. Employee-owned cooperatives, for example, have been reported to have almost double the income. This example here is from Wages, which is in the Bay Area in San Francisco, now known as Prospera, a house cleaning cooperative for immigrant women house cleaners, a traditionally very low wage, very unprotected industry. As they became members of the cooperative, their income went from $25,000 a year to $40,000 a year. So that's a significant boost, and that's just one example, but you see that often in other cooperative examples as well. Municipal-owned utilities, they are usually more affordable for the resident end users of the utilities, 13% less in monthly rates usually for resident owners. Moving on, Community Land Trust, which is a model of land held in trust by a nonprofit community-based organization that guarantees permanent affordability while while residents own the building, the home itself, and can build equity in that. During the height of the financial crisis, they had under a 1% foreclosure rate, significantly lower than the nearly 5% foreclosure rate nationally. So much better foreclosure rates in community land trusts. ESOPs have a much higher rate of retirement account savings, almost 2.2 times that of a traditional business. So there are many benefits to these forms. And they're also not a small portion of our economy. They have substantial assets. Cooperatives alone, and there are multiple kinds of cooperatives, consumer, producer, owner cooperatives, are $3 trillion in assets. Community investment institutions, $64 billion. These are significant. And right here at nonprofit hospitals and universities, we're talking about assets, $2 trillion. I want to talk a little bit more about nonprofit hospitals and universities and what we at the Democracy Collaborative call anchor institutions. So what is an anchor institution? An anchor institution is sticky capital. And what do we mean by that? It's not going anywhere. It's not going to leave the community. It's rooted in the community. This is a place-based institution. And it's a very large economic engine. It is one of the largest employers in most communities, and it purchases large amounts of goods and services locally. And they're nonprofit or public for the most part, meaning that they have a public mission. They are there to serve a community. And we're talking about hospitals, universities, but also local government, utilities, cultural institutions like museums, faith-based institutions. Institutions, again, that aren't going to pick up and leave. They're vested in the communities where they reside, and oftentimes have been there for a long time and hopefully won't be going anywhere anytime soon. So we look at anchor institutions as local sources of demand and huge economic returns. So what do they do? They, as I mentioned, they procure goods and services. Hospitals alone, for example, procure over $342 billion in goods and services a year. As I said, most anchor institutions are sometimes the largest employers in communities. Hospitals and universities certainly are, but I'm here in Washington, D.C., and the government is the largest employer here in our region, and as it is in many other places. County government, city government, state government are largest employers in many regions. But they're also investors. Institutions have endowments, and they invest in their communities. Hospitals alone, again, have $50 billion worth of investments annually. They're real estate developers. They build and they construct and they grow. So they have huge economic impact in our surrounding areas. And we believe that anchor institutions, together with community actors, community institutions, local enterprises, and government, can come together to create a more stable force for economic development. So looking at this diagram here on the left-hand side, you see the upside-down triangle with business at the top really playing an unwieldy role of influence down here with government at the table. When we talk about sort of community wealth building, that triangle is flipped, where you have a more balanced perspective, a more balanced drive of economic development, where, of course, enterprise and government have large roles to play, but so do these community-based actors, institutions and residents and community organizations and community-owned enterprises. So this is sort of how we visualize the rebalancing of community wealth building. And this is what we call the Cleveland model. It's a diagram of the Cleveland model. So this talks a little bit about the work that we've done in Cleveland with the Greater University Circle Initiative and the Evergreen Cooperative. But this is also a broader diagram for how you can create an inclusive ecosystem for community wealth building, where, as you'll see, anchor institutions are connected to worker-owned, community-owned companies that are supported by community foundations, municipal government, and technical assistance. Technical assistance usually in the form of a community development corporation, a workforce training association, a CDFI, things of that nature. And all of this goes back to support jobs, ownership, wealth creation, and asset building in communities. I would like to sort of redo this with a larger arrow circling back for the community into all aspects of this, because the idea is as jobs and wealth and ownership go out into the community, they're also bolstering both the government and the institutions and the enterprises. So it's a really cohesive circle of reinforcing asset development in the community. So talking a little bit about this Cleveland model, we have worked to develop and support the Evergreen Cooperatives, which is a network of 3 cooperatives currently, hopefully more, growing in the future, based in Cleveland that provide goods and services to the anchor institutions in Cleveland. So going back to that map I showed you earlier about place, there's an area of Cleveland called the University Circle District, and there are a number of institutions right in that area Case Western University, University Hospitals, the Cleveland Clinic, a number of cultural institutions, museums, and so forth, right in the heart of the city, and they're surrounded by a number of neighborhoods that have high unemployment, high levels of incarceration, and little access to jobs and opportunities. So the Greater University Circle Initiative developed with the Cleveland Foundation, which is one of the oldest community foundations in the country, really drawing together all of these actors to figure out how they can better connect this area, University Circle, with all its wealth and assets to these communities right nearby. And one way they did that was to develop this network of cooperatives that would employ local residents. They would eventually become owners, and they would provide goods and services to the universities and the hospitals in the area. So the three currently are Evergreen Cooperative Laundry, Evergreen Energy Solutions, and Green City Growers. The laundry is one of the largest ecologically green industrial laundry facilities in America, and they provide direct laundry services to the hospitals. Evergreen Energy Solutions is a solar and LED and green retrofit construction company that, again, provides services to the institutions. And Green City Growers is a huge hydroponic greenhouse that grows lettuce and spices and things that provide food for the cafeterias in the hospitals, as well as to local restaurants and businesses as well. So currently there are over actually 140 employees, and about 50 of them are worker owners. It takes about 6 months for them to vest into ownership, so not all the employees are yet owners. And then they are also, as owners, they have access to a housing assistance program, a car purchase assistance program, and other things like that, as well as supportive services such as continuing trainings and financial education and so forth within the cooperative. So how can cities, how can organizations support and develop this kind of work? And again, these are the results of the report that we just wrote, Cities Building Community Wealth. So we're looking particularly at how cities can advance this work and support this work in community city government. But of course, community foundations, community organizations, resident-led groups can also support this kind of work in different ways as well, and are doing so. So these can also be interpreted from different perspectives. But for now, we're looking at a city perspective and how city government can support this work. So anchor procurement, that's certainly something that cities are advancing themselves as anchor institutions. How are they procuring goods and services, and where is that coming from? But also encouraging collaboratives of anchor institutions within their communities to do this work, to procure goods and services locally, to hire locally, to connect their economic impacts locally. Financing, cities can do direct lending to this kind of work. They can partner with local community development financial institutions. They can leverage available capital in the forms of federal funds and local funds and direct that in meaningful ways. So one example where you're seeing a city-led anchor procurement effort is in Chicago. Chicago Anchors for a Strong Community, or CASE, was launched in 2014. And what's interesting about this example is that it has both a capacity building and a purchasing connection side. So it plays the role of a matchmaker, matching the city or the anchor institution to local providers. But then also, you can have as much demand as you want, but if you don't have local providers to service that demand, then it's really hard to make that match. So at the same time, the city is also partnering with a local organization, Next Street, to help develop capacity of local businesses to scale up to meet the demands of anchor institutions. So that just started a year ago. They have their initial aim in 2014 was to work with 100 local businesses in the first year. They're now in their second year. They've surpassed that goal and are working with more. So you're seeing in Chicago the city as an anchor institution using this. the University of Chicago, the hospital systems, University of Illinois system. All of these are working as part of this network. So other ways that cities can support this work: enterprise development, supporting cooperative development, creating incubators to incubate and accelerate enterprise development, local small business enterprise development of different forms. Encouraging conversion is something that's a fairly interesting opportunity. And when I say that, I mean converting ownership forms. So small businesses that may close, or even large companies that may move out of the area, rather than selling or leaving, they can convert or be bought out by their employees to root it locally. And there are different ways that cities can support that. Land use and real estate, there are different mechanisms that city governments can use to help support equitable land development, such as community land trusts. I mentioned that earlier. Land banks to reclaim blighted properties, and then reusing blighted properties in interesting ways, such as urban gardens and things of that nature. An example of that in New York City, not of the land per se, but of the enterprise development, New York City has pledged over $3 million in 2 years to support worker cooperatives, and that's direct support for starting and growing workers cooperatives in the city. In fact, they've increased that money in the last 6 months. I'm not exactly sure the amount, but Mayor de Blasio has pledged continuing support for that. And a great example is Cooperative Home Care Association in the Bronx. It's one of the largest employee-owned cooperatives in the country. It employs 23,000 largely immigrant women of color in home care jobs. Again, a very traditionally low-wage industry that doesn't have a lot of protections and guarantees for its employees. But in Cooperative Home Care Associates, they are guaranteed a living wage, and they have access to many benefits, including health care and additional training. So finally, the last of the 6 strategies that we identify that cities can support is using sustainability goals to drive inclusive job creation, using food hubs and municipal ownership to promote green energy and clean renewables. Workforce development, cities are already doing this, but thinking through how to create direct pipelines to anchor institutions, again, using that local demand, that existing demand to connect, job training directly to job needs. An example of that, and this is an excellent one also in Cleveland, is Step Up to University Hospitals. The university recognized that it had huge turnover in lower level positions, and they wondered why. So they dug into it. They realized that most of the people in those positions were coming from afar, had transportation difficulties, commuting from a long way, also had high needs in terms of family support and mechanisms. So the hospital connected with a number of local partners, including Towards Employment and Neighborhood Connections, to think through how they could hire people locally so that they wouldn't have to commute, and how they could support those people once they got in jobs in a better way to keep them in the jobs and reduce inefficiencies on the end of the hospital. So they created a program called pipeline program called Step Up to UH. They've had 3 rounds of training resulting in 28 hires, and they've noticed that they have managed to retain employees at a higher rate than they have before, 90% retention in the first 6 months of hiring these new employees. So significant change for the hospital, but then also creating a much more inclusive way of hiring local residents. But these are all just little examples here and there. Let's look at some bigger examples of what cities are doing. Denver, Colorado, there are lots of things going on in Denver, and I believe there are a number of folks on the line from Denver. The city's Office of Economic Development used community development block grants to invest $1.2 million in Revision International, a local organization that's creating the Westwood Food Cooperative. which will act as a food hub, aggregating food from actually grown in the backyards of local residents in an area where there are high rates of obesity. It's a food desert, and so there's poor access to high quality, healthy, and nutritious foods. And so they are working as a food hub to aggregate food grown in local backyards, employing residents who are growing that food, and then redistributing it to residents who don't have access to healthy food. Denver also is doing some interesting things using a community land trust model around transit-oriented development. So around transit hubs, using a land trust model to reduce rising housing costs near those nodes of transportation. And there have also been a number of community wealth building conferences hosted in the Denver area by the Denver Foundation, who's working very closely with the city and the Urban Land Conservancy and others. So you're seeing a lot of collaborative work and inclusive work with community organizations happening here. But this, lest you believe that this model only applies in urban focus, we're doing some work, as I mentioned earlier, with Native American communities as well, 3 of which are reservation-based. And some of the work that's happening on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota is really exciting. Thunder Valley CDC, and I encourage you to go to their website, and they have a video about the work that they're doing that's really very powerful. It's a young community development corporation that grew up out of a sort of desire to reclaim their spiritual roots on the reservation, and realized that they needed or desired to create their own wealth, their own economy, and their own community on the reservation. So they're developing a regenerative community from the ground up. They've done an intensive community planning process with the Oglala Lakota tribe there on Pine Ridge, and they have bought up 33 acres that they will be developing using culturally appropriate net zero housing and building forms. And as part of this, they realize that they'll be creating a fair amount of economic activity as a result. And so rather than contracting a company from Rapid City or some other faraway location, they decided they wanted to have that economic activity that they're generating benefit their community. So they're creating a workforce training program to train Lakota youth and tribal members in these indigenous housing forms of construction. And they will then, once they graduate through the workforce training program, have the opportunity to be employed in an employee-owned construction company, which Thunder Valley will be opening later this year. Hopefully, they're aiming for April or May. And then that's just the start of what they see as a whole network enterprise program as part of this community. It'll involve property management, wastewater treatment, things of that nature. And of course, as they're doing this, they're looking at all sorts of different forms of ownership and affordability. They will be using land trust forms to build in affordability, sweat equity to develop the houses. This will be an employee-owned construction company, and so will the other enterprises that they envision. So it's a really powerful and dynamic collaborative ecosystem that they're building on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And in this model, you see the Community Development Corporation acting as the anchor institution with what they're purchasing and what they're building and so forth, being the economic engine there, and then developing a whole supply chain of enterprise around those needs and that demand, employing local residents, building skills, rooting wealth locally, and having it recirculate. So it's a really powerful vision. And again, I encourage you to check that out. So how to begin? How do you start with this work? Again, a lot of it is already happening in communities. So finding out what's going on, looking at the assets that are already there. So the first step is really to identify roles. If you're city government looking to do this, what is your role? Are you going to convene the players? Are you going to support through funding? Maybe a little bit of both. Really be clear on your role, and then also the role of the other collaborative actors and stakeholders at the table. Then inventorying the assets. These things are already happening in communities. Assets already exist in communities. What are they, and how can they be leveraged and better connected? Determining demand. This is what we think of as the anchor institution piece. What is being bought and sold and purchased in the community, and how can it be redirected locally? Fostering collaboration. That's a huge role for anchor for people doing this work. Again, if you're a city trying to do this work, looking at pardon me, there seems to be a phone ringing in the background, which is distracting me, and I apologize. And then planning your approach. Before you begin, once you already understand what's in the community, what relationships and assets exist, how can you connect those, and then continually reevaluate, come back and evaluate how the work is going and how it can be done better. That's something that the work in the Greater University Circle Initiative in Cleveland with the Evergreen Cooperative continues to do. And how can you improve this in the next iteration? You must learn from the mistakes and continue to go on. So how can you do this in the work that you're already doing? Community wealth building drivers, add that to the work that you're already doing. So if you're already doing enterprise development, how can you do enterprise development in a way that also fosters alternative forms of ownership? Many cities, as we said, give incentives and subsidies to corporations, but how can you shift that locally? We understand that that's never going to fully end, but how can you shift that in a way that guarantees that jobs are being created locally and money is recirculating locally? Work as anchor institutions. See your own economic activity and how to redirect that so that it's flowing locally. Adapt and anchor, so that's the adapting and anchor mission. Innovate in workforce development, so connect those pipelines. Where are the job needs and how do you get the people in the community into those jobs? In some ways, we find that creating a new city office where you have what we call a front door, where all of these activities are coming together in one place so that people don't have to navigate a myriad map of different departments and different agencies. One office that navigates all of these. We're seeing that work being done in Richmond, Virginia. They created a new office on community wealth building that pulls together all of their poverty reduction strategies in one office and in one department, so people can come and work with them as a front door. And then recognize scale. So how one thing that people say is, well, one small business here isn't going to solve our problem. That's true, but yet there are all these opportunities to scale in many different directions. And I do want to pull out at least 3 on this slide that are really important. The new nonprofit hospital mandate under the Affordable Care Act to consider social determinants of health. So the Affordable Care Act is requiring that hospitals do community health needs assessments and then understand how they can address the needs of the community. So the goal there is to be looking at health more broadly, and this again is a requirement for nonprofit hospitals in order to get ACA funding. So it's a real leverage point for communities to ask their hospitals to work with them and think more broadly about economic impacts on health and social determinants of health. The stormwater management crisis, the EPA has mandated that we convert many of our surfaces to better manage our stormwater runoff and so forth. How can you use that to develop jobs and generate economic activity locally? We were working with a community here in the DC area in Prince George's County who had a large mandate from the EPA because of the Chesapeake Bay watershed to improve their runoff facilities. So they were thinking, the county government was thinking through how they could do that and also introduce a community wealth building effort that would create employee-owned cooperative, hiring local residents and training them in the expertise of rainwater and water runoff remediation. The baby boom entrepreneur retirement, we call that the silver tsunami. So baby boomers in our country own over 4 million businesses, and they're all retiring in the next 5 to 10 years. What's going to happen to those businesses? Most do not get turned over to their children, and so many will be sold, often moved or downsized, and a number will close their doors and no longer exist. So how can we take advantage of that turnover in ownership to convert those businesses to employee-owned businesses, to keep them operating in the communities rather than relocating, downsizing, or closing their doors entirely? So there are a number of opportunities where this work can go to scale in a meaningful way. So I guess that brings me to the end here. I feel like I've rambled a lot. There's lots to cover, and I hope I did a sufficient job at covering that. And I am happy to take questions. I think I'm just over time a little bit, and I'm going to claim technical difficulties for that, but I hope we have some time for questions, and I look forward to a conversation.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and I do apologize again for the technical issues at the beginning, but we do have a few questions, and so we can dive right into them. I just want to remind folks also that you can just type your questions into the questions panel on your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we have time for. So let's get started. I have a question from Matthew. He asks, when it comes to connecting anchors to local suppliers, how do you get around competitive bidding requirements?
Well, that is an excellent question, and the question really gets at a lot of anchor institutions. Well, there are a couple things too. They also have large contracts with big service providers like Aramark and things like that. That's very difficult for them to get in out of. So that's another challenge as well. So that's a very good question. Mm-hmm. And, you know, part of it is changing the culture of the way business is done at the anchor institutions, which of course is easier said than done. But part of it you can get around by having fairly minimal goals. So if the goal is to source, say, 2% of your procurement locally, and sometimes that's what you have to start with, you might not even be able to service much more than that from local providers to begin with. You still have a chunk of your procurement that will go out to competitive bidding as well. So that's one way to do it. But it is a challenge, and a lot of this has to do with the way that business is done at the institutional level. And so one thing that we recommend is to try and get buy-in and support as high up the institution as you possibly can. So, for example, in the case of Cleveland, the Cleveland Clinic, for example, the head of the Cleveland Clinic really decided to embrace the anchor institution, mandated that they shift percentages of business in certain ways. So it really was a comprehensive change in business policy for the institution. But it is a challenge, and of course also the purchasing requirements and contracts from the group purchasing organizations or GPOs is another barrier. But shifting, there are ways, and I've seen it done also, where they can change those agreements through the actual contractor. So you still contract with Aramark, but then they purchase from a local purchaser. So you can change your contract so that there are certain local purchasing requirements that the supplier has to fulfill. And Drexel University in Philadelphia has done it that way, for example. So there are ways around it, but it is a challenge.
Okay, I have a question from Michael who asks about what place equitable transportation has in these efforts to build up communities and the community workforce. Well, I guess I'd ask exactly what is meant by equitable transportation. So I would imagine the question is really around equitable transportation planning and how to connect better communities to one another and to sources of economic activity. And I think a lot of that is in the planning. I think having
more community engagement in planning transportation development is huge, and how to engage the community in determining development around transportation is one way. But then again, as I mentioned sort of earlier, there are different forms once you actually begin transportation development of securing affordability and access at transportation modes using land trust models and things of that nature is one way to do it. But if the question is really about how to ensure that transportation development is more equitable, I really believe that to be in the engagement and planning stages, to begin with. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I think that hit it. But anyone can go ahead and type in clarification if you'd like to. I think that one's from Michael. In the meantime, we will get to this one about the baby boomer retirement phase.
The silver tsunami.
Yeah. He says, I see a slightly different opportunity that would be to capture that expertise in the form of mentors and business advisors. And have you given that any consideration?
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, there are a number of those businesses who are very much involved in seeing this transition happen. So there are a number of business owners who want to transfer ownership to their employees and are really working through how to promote that kind of conversion on a broader scale to other companies. And you see those business owners playing a role in these conversion plans, and as you said, pardon me, as providing mentorship opportunities to others. And I know that specifically in regards to the conversion part that I mentioned, but clearly engaging the expertise of those business owners as you incubate and accelerate small business at a local level would be huge as well. So I think that certainly has a role to play, and I think that will definitely be considered as you start to see this happening more and more.
Okay, and a question from Elizabeth. She says, I appreciate the interview you recently had in Yes about community wealth building in the context of gentrification. And she asks, have you seen examples where communities and local CDCs have succeeded in weaving new residents and investors into a community wealth framework?
So I guess the question is,
success in sort of dealing with gentrification issues as far as...
specifically gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
Gentrification is a challenge, and certainly I know it's a sensitivity when talking about anchor institutions, because in many communities, anchor institutions also use their economic might to change and craft community growth and change in a way that's more beneficial to them and often leaves out existing residents. So it is a sensitive topic. And again, I guess the best example is to really focus on engagement, community engagement, having that be an authentic engagement rather than, just checking off the box. We engaged communities by having this one meeting. What does actual authentic community engagement look like, and how do institutions and other economic actors work directly with communities to ensure that you're not just displacing populations, but rather developing for them? One organization that does this excellently is Nexus Community Partners in the Twin Cities. They work with local community organizations as well as institutions to have really meaningful conversations around engagement and what that looks like, to invite community actors to the table with anchor institutions to make sure that they're having deep dialogue about that. A lot of their work that they're doing is very much in the initial stages, so it's hard to say what the ultimate outcomes will be, but there is a lot of really deep thinking and engagement going on there that we believe will be successful, but it's hard to say right now what the outcomes will be. But that's one good example that I would recommend looking up.
Great, thanks. So that pretty much hits our time limit. I think we hit all of the questions. I'll go through and make sure, but if we missed your question, I will post answers on our blog as soon as I can. So you'll want to check out our blog at communitybuilders.org if we missed your question. So thanks to Sarah. Thanks, Sarah McKinley, for our great presentation. Thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much. It was great to be here.
Yeah, and thanks also to our underwriter this month, who is the Small Urban and Rural Livability Center at Montana State University's Western Transportation Institute. You can find out more information about our underwriter on their website, which is on your screen, I do believe, yes. So check them out, and if you or your company is interested in underwriting our webinar series this year, you can contact me. By email, I'm Allison at communitybuilders.org. We'll also post today's PowerPoint slides and a recording of today's presentation on our webinars page on our website. A lot of folks have asked about that. You'll be able to find that at communitybuilders.org/webinars. I'll try to get that up as soon as I can, probably later today. And you can also check our website for information on next month's session, which I'm still finalizing, but I should have information up there soon. If you're a planner receiving continuing education credits for today's session, this session counts for one AICP certification maintenance credit with the American Planning Association. Today's webinar is event number 9028069. To redeem your credits, log on to your profile on the APA website and find this webinar in the calendar. For other professionals, if you'd like to receive a certificate of attendance for this webinar, you can provide your email address in our survey, which will pop up as you exit the webinar, or you can always just drop me a line at allison@communitybuilders.org. I'll try to send out certificates later today as well. Our survey also has a few questions about the quality of the session and about future possible topics for webinars, so we really value your feedback. I'd appreciate it if you could let us know what you think by filling out the survey, or you can send any feedback via email as well. And you can also keep in touch with us on social media through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We'd love to stay in touch with you, so keep the conversation going. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and have a great day.